Hello, everyone. My name is Roopa Sunku, and I'm here with you folks going through another Mentor Loop session. Touch a Life Foundation has sponsored these podcasts where we would like to encourage you to be part of our career help initiative to come back and get the community engaged into the professional workforce or to be able to uplift your career based on where you are and the challenges that you may face. So today's topic that I'm going to talk about is feedback. We all need feedback and we need people who will give us feedback as well. And that's how we can improve, says Bill Gates. What is feedback? Feedback is information that you are getting from peers, employees, supervisors, or customers about what they feel are your strengths, your weaknesses, and any gaps in the product or services that you're offering. So these are the people that provide the feedback, and there could be different types of feedback that they provide. One could be negative feedback, one could be positive feedback, and the third one, which I think is the most useful and has the power and capability to create change and create improvement and innovation, is constructive feedback. So, what is negative feedback? Negative feedback is when you are sharing with a person, be it a peer, employee, or a customer, that you're not happy with the services that you have received or the job that that particular person has done in terms of where they should have been and what should have been achieved. Most often, when we provide negative feedback, there is a tension. There is a little bit of degrading or belittling the people. So, the negativity in the language and just the emotional constraints that you show often make negative feedback very difficult to accept and very difficult to manage overall. Both the person who gives the feedback and receives the feedback is in an uncomfortable position. We'll talk about how we can make sure that the feedback is delivered in a very succinct fashion and will actually create the necessary change that you're looking for with negative feedback. The positive feedback is definitely happy grounds. You express and you encourage and you approve the various services, projects, and work that the person has done. Purpose of this positive feedback is to reinforce people and reinforce the behaviors and encourage a positive culture and an environment around you. The constructive feedback, as I told you, is my favorite because it is very specific and concrete steps to improve the performance. You may be good, but you can get better. So positive feedback plus concentrated or concrete focused steps to make it even better is constructive feedback. Purpose of this constructive feedback is to be able to modify the environment and change the environment, create initiative, create excitement, create engagement, and make this very innovative environment as well, and being able to get people beyond their potential. You create a sense of respect and you create a sense of baseline behavior that can be contagious and encouraging. So, feedback, when given well, should not alienate any of the receivers and should also motivate them to perform better. So, this is where I think feedback is very effective if you do it in this fashion. Now, let's talk about 9 steps or tips in order to give peer feedback. All right. So, the first one is you have to come prepared. Be very specific. Try to evade any vague connotative strengths. Make sure you tie it back to the strengths and the steps that need to be done in terms of making this better or making this even better or making this neutral. So come prepared, have all the specific details. Do not focus and hone in on one specific incident, but look at an overall timeline of activities and come back with feedback on that. There may be specific projects that you are doing a feedback on, and those specific projects or specific scenarios also look at it in a holistic fashion, in the environment, in the ecosystem, and then come back with feedback. The second important thing to give feedback is to adapt to the other person's style. So if the person's communicative style is very docile, very submissive, you should make sure you cannot be rambunctious and very loud, but to try and neutralize. Doesn't have to be exactly soft-spoken and mellow like the receiver, but you need to not be the other extreme of the pendulum either. So make sure that you are matching the communication styles, because it's important. Not only communication style, the tone, the voice, the presence needs to neutralize in some form or shape, so that you are not at two ends of the yardstick and are in some kind of a middle ground, making the feedback a lot more conducive to be received and to be given. Then avoid what is known as the feedback sandwich. This is, don't get into a situation where you're giving feedback and getting input and then trying to react to that impact. So the importance is to go ahead and come in with setting the tone, then delivering the input, and yes, you may need to give a corollary response to the feedback giver, but neutralize it and make sure that you are handling it in a way that it is not going to get controversial. And so this way, it will reduce the back and forth or the feedback sandwich approach. Do all of this feedback in a quick fashion and don't catch the other person off guard. It's important to go ahead and do it as the problems are beginning or as the improvement and the performance has been really good, because as you catch it early, you can make sure that you're making the best of your feedback, and the feedback will have its time to be able to mull and gel into all the activities that you're providing feedback on. Make sure that your language is non-judgmental, especially when you're giving feedback to a peer. It's super important to be very clear and not make it a situation where it gets competitive, but at the same token should be effective as well. So use language that is comfortable and not creating competition, jealousy, comparison between the two peers in the language that you use. Then the sixth point would be focus on the problem, not the person. So don't say you did this and this is the feedback or this is the impact we've had. You would probably have to phrase it as, let's talk about the situation that we had in the store the other day. The escalation that was handled could have worked out better if you had set aside your emotions and addressed the process or the service or the problem that needed to be unstuck. So keep the focus on the problem and not the emotional, the physical, the appearance, or the body language that was included in that situation or that scenario. And when you depersonalize it, it becomes simpler and easier to not be negative and not criticize, but to actually correct the situation. The seventh point in any feedback is to make it very conversational. You need to make sure that you don't get into that feedback sandwich, but make it a two-way conversation with no interruptions or dialogues or monologues. Make sure you provide the feedback, and it's a two-way street where you're encouraging and you're listening to the peer itself. So people may be confused with the whole feedback sandwich, where you kind of get into a critical mode of including praises and criticism as well. But in this point, what I'm trying to say here is make it appear like you're not being dictatorial in the conversation, but you're being more democratic with the approach that you take in your feedback process. Ask, but do not assume anything when you're providing feedback. You can say, are you comfortable with what we've shared today? Or is there any other discussions that you would like to make or observations that you may have that'll help us get this feedback loop more holistic? So definitely ask. Do not assume. Don't say, I think you didn't like the way it was done. I don't like what was done. Or I think you were very emotional and it was too personal and you didn't make a good choice for the company. Those sort of terminology or assumptions should be refrained. Also, there are multiple tools that I'll talk about in terms of giving feedback. And some of the tools that I'd like to share with you is the ninth primary point in terms of feedback. Use these process tools to be able to deliver the feedback more holistically. So it's a very interesting statement that Stephen Covey makes. He says, it takes humility to seek feedback. It takes wisdom to understand it and analyze it and appropriately act on it. So I think that is super critical to remember that everybody feels terrible if they're being called out for an error or a mistake that they've made. So receive it with humility. And make sure you take that step of wisdom to understand what the person was trying to say or what the perspective that person was trying to deliver. And then analyze it and make those changes. And that is what we are referring to with the situational behavioral impact tool. So SBI for short. So start with the situation, define the exact situation you want to discuss, identify the behaviors you want to talk about and the changes that you want to bring in those behaviors. It's super important, as I've mentioned earlier, to listen and not rely on gossip or could have, should have kind of scenarios, but take the exact behavior that was exhibited in that situation. And lastly, look at what its impact was. Explain the behavior and the environment and see how you can come out of that argument or that embarrassing or that very drastic move that happened in that particular situation. So again, it's called the SBI feedback tool, which is situation, behavior, and impact. The next feedback tool that I want to share with you is called the CEDAR feedback tool. So CEDAR is, again, an acronym that stands for context, for C, which is set the context or the environment that you have. In the SBI tool, we talked about it as situation. The same thing is related to in the CEDAR tool, where you're calling it context. Then E stands for examples. Do not assume. Always make sure to ask. So you can provide an example when you say you are a bad leader, for example. You want to set the context saying these are the different examples that created this aura in the team, and thus the context of this feedback session is based on some of the leadership opportunities that you have lost. Then diagnosis is D in the CEDAR model. Diagnosing what actually happened, what behaviors got portrayed, and what impressions were made, or what assumptions were confusing should be identified, root caused, and that is what diagnosis phase will include. The next is action. Action is about what is the change that you need to make in behavior, in process, in communication style, in the tone, or the exceptions that we may be able to handle within the service or the project should be considered as part of the action. After the action has been completed, make sure you use the review or the R in the Cedar tool, which says review it. Look at it from first to the very end and see if the changes that you've taken, the actions that you've taken, have actually been modified. And the feedback now is that this leader has become a lot more communicative, a lot more relatable, and a lot more accessible so that they can be a good leader and be able to influence the team. So once again, we talked about the SBI tool, which is situation, behavior, impact. Now we've talked about Cedar tool, which is context, examples, diagnosis, action, and review. And the last tool that I would like to talk about is called the IDEA model. I stands for identifying. So it could be the situation, it could be the behavior. Identify what you have worked on. Then describe it. So it's very similar to the examples. Describe the behavior, the pattern, the emphasis for the correction that you want to create a positive impact with. Then encourage. That is the change, which could be seen as constructive feedback as well. Encourage the movement from one side of the pendulum to the other side, or one side of the commitment to the other side, making sure there is trust, cohesion, motivation, which will boost the ego and create a positive environment. And lastly, for IDEA is action. Action is super important because you can talk about the situation, you can describe it, you can analyze it, and you can encourage the change. But in order to make it constructive, you need to see if those changes have actually created the necessary impact through the actions that get exhibited. So once again, SBI, Cedar, and IDEA models. Those are some of the tools that you can use to make sure that your feedback is holistic, complete, and thorough in terms of what you share with the people. I'd like to leave you with everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And this is said by Carl Jung, who is very right. Because often enough, something that annoys you is your pet peeve. And if you reflect back and say, you know what, it's probably my pet peeve that created this situation, we will be able to come out of it. And the feedback mechanics will also play out differently as you look at the scenario and the situation. And more importantly, I want to kind of talk about constructive feedback. So what I like about constructive feedback, as I mentioned to you earlier, is that it always clarifies the intent. And you are providing a context and describing the situation and giving an opinion on the situation. And then the fifth step is making a recommendation. This is fully engaged and you're present in the moment and you're looking at the future as well. And thus, I think constructive feedback is the most important style that I have utilized and seen a difference. Because as most people say, don't come with problems, come with solutions. So I look at the constructive feedback as a very similar method. So I hope I've been able to give you some tips and ideas on how to deliver feedback and how to receive feedback and the usage of constructive feedback to be effective, along with the three models of IDEA, Cedar, and SBI that you may be able to utilize. Thank you again for listening in, and please do visit us on touchalife.org/career help if you'd like to engage in any kind of mentoring folks around you or folks within our system, or would like to be mentored by any of our professional folks on the team. So once again, thank you, and some more good sessions and mentor loops to come in. And if you have any ideas as well, please drop me a note and we'll be happy to consider a conversation around that. Thank you.